The Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of the most frustrating games I've ever played because it's constantly at odds with itself, caught in the crossroads of what it can be, what it wants to be, and what it unfortunately is. What was once one of the most requested video game remakes of all time has now become the most controversial. For a story about defying destiny, its own fate was unavoidable. When you remake something as universally loved as Final Fantasy VII, you're playing with fire. People have a deep attachment to what they enjoy, so when what they love is morphed and altered to be unrecognizable, it inadvertently signals that they liked the wrong thing. And if there's one constant that defines the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it would be those differences. When talking about remakes, you're often forced to pick a side. Either you're all for it or completely against it. If you're watching this video hoping that I'm going to rip this game to shreds or act like it's an objective improvement, then you're in the wrong place. The FF7 Remake is neither a masterpiece nor a disgrace, but it does fail to accomplish its mission statement, and that's where the real nuance lies. In trying to please everyone, Square Enix pleased no one. Final Fantasy VII Remake has a serious identity crisis, and it's one entirely of its own making.
The reunion at hand may bring joy. It may bring fear. But let us embrace whatever it brings.
While Final Fantasy VII might be the most important JRPG ever made, it was also the first title Square developed for the PlayStation. What was once groundbreaking has begun to show its age. Back in the early 2000s, the jump from the 5th generation to the 6th was staggering. Games like Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts blew audiences away with never-before-seen detail and fantastic game design. Square was always at the cutting edge of presentation. If you wanted to play a game that felt like a blockbuster movie, then Final Fantasy was always your go-to. With the advent of new technology came the desire to improve the past. Final Fantasy VII wasn't even a decade old before the desire for a remake implanted itself firmly in the community. If you think gamers are obsessed with remakes now, you should have seen just how desperate people were for a remake of 7. That PS3 tech demo had people by the balls. People wanted this so bad that they bought that mega expensive console on the slim chance that a full remake would eventually come out. I wonder if this happened again with Versus 13. Anyway, the point is, people wanted this, and they wanted it bad. Square definitely knew this too. I will never forget how mad people were when the original game was revealed to be coming to PS4. At the time, people were convinced that it was now or never, and that history was just decided. But really, this was just a primer for the main event.
At last, the promise has been made.
This was it. The fans had finally won and gotten their wish. Final Fantasy VII was getting a from-the-ground-up remake for the PlayStation 4. Almost as quickly as this remake was announced, did expectations shift wildly. What everyone thought was going to be a straightforward remake was actually a much more ambitious project. Following the news cycle of this game's development was like an emotional roller coaster. Whether it be the original idea to outsource the remake to CyberConnect 2 before cutting ties, the Advent Children cast had been completely replaced, the fact that turn-based combat was abandoned in favor for real-time combat, and the most important detail, the reveal that this was going to be a multi-part saga. While a necessity for the sheer scope of the project, it was this decision that should have signaled loud and clear that this was not going to be the same Final Fantasy VII that we remembered. I remember feeling extremely mixed about all of this. It felt like every announcement came with some sort of catch. While I was excited to play the game, I couldn't shake the caution, especially since Square's titles from around this point were very inconsistent. Even if the story were to stay exactly the same, there was no doubt the gameplay experience was going to be entirely different. The prospect of doing something like that to a game as legendary as Final Fantasy VII was both exciting and terrifying. In the best case scenario, this would end up being a cool interpretation of a classic story, but told through a modern lens, with more conventional game design. Or it could massively backfire and be a big waste of time and money. The only thing we as fans could do was just wait and see the results. And oh boy did we end up waiting! It took close to 5 years after the announcement for this thing to even come out. And when it did, Final Fantasy VII was changed forever. Almost immediately were fans divided on this remake. Some viewed it as a refreshing experience. taking a classic everyone knows and loves and subverting expectations to deliver something both creative and unique. While others thought that the changes were completely unnecessary, the pacing was terrible, and that Square had no idea what they were doing. Two wildly dramatic responses if you were to ask me, but it's easy to see why. Final Fantasy VII is a lot of people's favorite game ever. And like I already mentioned, there was a lot of hype behind this one. When you wait nearly 15 years for something and it's a letdown, yeah, being pissed off is a pretty reasonable reaction. As for me, I remember liking the game a lot when it came out, but if I'm being 100% honest, I haven't played it since. Part of me was worried that those good memories would vanish the moment I hit the start button, that maybe I was overtaken by the hype, and when examining this remake so far from release, it would end up crumbling under scrutiny. I'm sure we've all had something like that happen to us. The last thing I wanted to do was slump over to my old video and sheepishly leave a comment saying that I no longer agreed with. Ah, fuck it, I'm putting it off. Let's just talk about the game.
It's over!
That's my line.
When the idea of a Final Fantasy VII Remake began to make the rounds, the chosen combat style was a major concern. While turn-based combat dominated the JRPG subgenre back in the day, in the modern world, they're a lot less prevalent. The most common type of RPG made in today's market are action RPGs. These are games that use real-time combat, but are supplemented by traditional RPG mechanics like equipment and character classes. The main motivation for this is that players don't like to feel as if they aren't in control of every action they take. Turn-based games, despite my enjoyment of them, come with the limitation of never feeling like you yourself are actively involved in the combat. While this is factually untrue when you really break down the goals of these games, the psychological effect of being an outsider to the action drives a lot of people away from the genre. For over 20 years now, Square has had a funky relationship with turn-based combat. Even before Final Fantasy fully embraced real-time gameplay, you can see Square slowly transition away from the old battle system. When I really think about it, Square has always been trying to find ways to make their turn-based games more involved than the rest. The ATB system was meant to add a level of active decision-making and skill development that you couldn't get with traditional turn-based combat. The idea was introduced as early as Final Fantasy IV and stuck around for well over a decade. If you were to critically look at all of the games that featured this battle system, then you'll notice that as the franchise continued forward, more and more gameplay gimmicks needed to be introduced to embody combat growth. While you can point fingers where and when the trend started, I think I'm safe in saying that the last game to use traditional Final Fantasy combat would be 2003's Final Fantasy X-2. From then on, Square has been slowly transitioning away from what they're known for in favor for a bold new direction. Honestly, I don't blame them. In the years leading up to 7 Remake's reveal, there was already growing friction between players and this classic combat style. It doesn't take much effort to find a large group of people adamantly against turn-based games. Some of the most common criticisms tend to be that they're too slow, offer little feedback, or it's considered immersion breaking. The first 2 points are understandable, but their validity varies between games. That last point was always one I never fully understood. It's one of those subjects that makes sense when only viewed through a surface-level lens, but falls apart the moment you apply critical thinking to it. The entire appeal of a role-playing game is to play a role. Final Fantasy VII has us play as a super soldier turned mercenary. The story sets Cloud up as an experienced swordsman with years of combat experience. While you might think the best way to embody that in gameplay would be to give players direct control over the character at all times, it's much more nuanced than that. Sure, having Cloud respond to every individual button press will link the player and character faster than a turn-based game can, but it creates a new divide in the narrative if the player doesn't have the proper skills to match the character's innate abilities. When cutscene Cloud is portrayed as an unstoppable badass but fumbles around during combat, it creates a discrepancy that will ruin the immersion. This divide doesn't exist in turn-based combat because Cloud's execution happens independently of the player's input. If I tell him to do one thing, it'll be carried out with the same level of skill and consistency as in the narrative. I don't know, that sounds a little more immersive for a role-playing game if you were to ask me. The fact that this conversation even happens at all is most likely the reason why Square pivoted away from the old in favor of something new. For how ambitious this project is when taken in its totality, yeah, you kinda want to maximize the number of people willing to pay for your game. As much as we hate to admit it, it's smarter in the business world to make a real-time action game instead of a turn-based one. Does that mean turn-based games are bad? No. But audience expectations have changed. This was never going to have turn-based combat, and we had a long time to accept this fact. I'm not entirely against the idea of remakes and reboots changing things up to such a degree. I'll never pass on the opportunity for game designers to flex their muscles and experiment a bit. However, in the case of a remake, I still expect the overall gameplay to carry on the same spirit as the classic. Final Fantasy VII on PS1 is a turn-based RPG that uses its mechanics and design to enforce teamwork. This gameplay style works a lot for what the story is going for, while also being a solid combat system. The remake places itself in a similar position, needing to justify its own existence on top of being a well-designed and balanced game. You're not just trying to appeal to a new audience, you need to convince the old heads that this remake will offer something special to them. So, how well does Final Fantasy VII Remake accomplish this goal? Honestly, the transition is a lot smoother than you would expect. But, much like with all modern Square Enix titles, there are some pretty big flaws with what's on offer. Not enough to be bad, but flawed in a way that prevents this game from reaching that legendary action status that it aspires to achieve. The combat goal of Final Fantasy VII Remake was to translate that classic battle system into a real-time setting while retaining as many core ideas as possible. We still only have 3 active party members at once, materia is the main source of customization, and the ATB meter is at the heart of battle. However, the dynamic has completely shifted. Whereas ATB was previously used to serve the player, this game takes the opposite approach. Since turn order is no longer a thing in this game, ATB was repurposed to be your action economy. While you always have access to your basic abilities, any special actions like using an item, combat skills, or magic comes at the cost of at least 1 ATB charge. During a neutral state, ATB fills up slowly on its own, but the speed can be increased if you land attacks with your active character. Under normal circumstances, every party member can have at most 2 ATB bars filled at once. And when you hit that cap, any additional basic attacks start to lose their benefits. At a glance, this combat system might look to be essentially the same thing as the original game. Though that line of thinking doesn't hold up when you look beyond the surface level. In the original FF7, ATB was used as a way to communicate turn order. The literal combat of the game wasn't defined by this time-based system. All it did was give a visual indication of when your next party member was going to act. This is a completely different story in the remake. Now ATB acts as an expendable resource, one that does come back, but a resource nonetheless. Building your entire action gameplay loop around a system like this is a risky play. The best part about action games is the level of freedom they offer the player. The best of the best encourage skill development and mastery, really forcing you to push past your limitations and make the most out of your kit. This is usually achieved through difficulty or supplementary design like a ranking system. By introducing innate limitations on what can and cannot be done at any given moment, a foreign level of friction has now been added. Some of you might know this, but I can't stand cooldown timers, especially in a real-time context. I find that they're often used as a shallow method to balance overpowered skills. If an ability ends up being disgustingly strong, then the solution tends to be to crank up its cooldown. The problem is that this solution doesn't actually fix the problem at hand. If you have an attack that costs nothing and can instantly win you the fight, but lock it behind a 2-minute countdown timer, you just made it so players now have a free crutch in every fight. Cooldowns also encourage a boring, just dump everything playstyle, since time spent holding onto a command could have been used to fill up a new one. It's the opposite philosophy of what action combat should be encouraging. While this idea wouldn't work in a traditional action game environment, it thrives in a Final Fantasy context. The limitation that comes with the ATB system, by nature, makes every charge spent an important decision in the moment. For example, if you're surrounded by enemies and have one charge on Cloud, what you end up spending it on will differ wildly depending on specific factors. You may take on a more offensive role and spend your charge to deal massive damage, potentially ending the fight. Or, if your health is low, fall back on a more defensive strategy. It's a very basic choice reminiscent of the classic game and its structure. Though, with the real-time setting and mechanics that come along with that, new layers are introduced to this interaction. Maybe you have a materia equipped that will allow you to take advantage of an enemy's weakness. If there's a foe already in the pressured state, it would be a good idea to pick an attack designed around generating stagger instead of dealing raw damage. If those options are available with just one party member, then you can imagine how much more complex battles become when you have a full party of 3. The ATB system also encourages a level of skill development that's entirely unique to this game's combat. Early on, you'll probably end up giving every character some form of healing materia to fall back on when the going gets rough. Though, as you acquire new skills and abilities, those defensive strategies transform from a safety net into a combat pace breaker. One of the best feelings in an action game is when you enter that flow state, and suddenly muscle memory begins to matter over raw thought. You think less and less about the next attack since your brain has already familiarized itself with the kit at your disposal. The same is true for Final Fantasy VII Remake, but more effort is required to reach that state. Since everything is built around the ATB system, the skill development comes from finding ways to minimize the time where the ATB needs to be spent on recovering from poor positions. If the ATB charge doesn't immediately benefit the game plan in some way, then that charge was misused. Assessing an enemy takes one charge and one materia slot to do, but in return you're able to view all the vital information needed to take that enemy down. Despite the utility of the assessed materia, it's ultimately an early game crutch. No matter how you slice it, you're wasting resources trying to find an advantage. It's a tool designed for learning, not something that should always be relied on. After a while, you'll start to notice patterns. Humanoid enemies are all susceptible to poison, machines are always weak to lightning. Certain enemies will become pressured when you block or counter their attacks. After some practice, you'll start relying on the assess skill less and less, eventually forgetting about it entirely when fighting random enemies. At that point, you'll begin to rationalize to yourself the real benefits to having the assess materia equipped before eventually replacing it with some niche tech options or a passive stat increase. If we can do that just by approaching the knowledge check differently, then imagine what we could get away with if we develop our execution skills. ATB creates this nice feedback loop where your skill development directly influences the way you treat the resource. It'll go from being this get-out-of-jail-free card from taking too much damage to being a countdown to when you're allowed to unleash the pain. You're encouraged to master enemy formations and build your characters around taking on multiple scenarios. The reward for skillful play is the flexibility to let go of those crutch tools you use to keep yourself in the fight. I've seen so many playthroughs of this game where the one copy of Magnify is permanently paired with the healing materia. While it's true it gives you instant access to party-wide healing, the unfortunate truth is that this ends up being a crutch for most players. Magnify has so many better uses out there that pairing it with Cure should only be saved as a last resort. Off the top of my head, pairing Magnify with Barrier or Time Magic has far more value compared to healing. I hear a lot of people refer to this game as a button masher, but that couldn't be further from the truth. While correct in the sense that there's little to no combo variation, each attack has its own source of utility and opportune time to execute. Basic attacks fill ATB faster. It's an immediate reward for applying pressure. Braver is an attack with a lot of base power, but comes with decent starting and ending lag. This prevents it from being an attack that you'll throw out blindly against larger foes, but it can be a quick closer for the trash mobs. Triple Slash is an attack that gets stronger with each successive hit, but by nature, it causes Cloud to jump between targets. Disorder doesn't deal the most amount of damage on its own, but its utility in acting as an attack cancel gives it an ever-useful purpose. The button mashing mindset is only applicable if you rely too much on your defensive play instead of adapting to the scenario. Losing your footing in 7 Remake is deadly. Party members going down set you back a considerable distance depending on the fight. It's the reason why the screen enters a constant warning state when only one character has died. You're meant to always have all party members active, since losing out on ATB can be the difference between life and death. Healing and revival magic might be the solution for some, but the more effective strategy is to limit the number of times you need to heal, period. Skill expression in FF7 Remake doesn't so much come from how you can link attacks together, but rather it's in how you can force the tempo of the battle to match your playstyle. And it's through this lens where the ATB system's inclusion makes the most sense. Final Fantasy VII Remake's take on this idea was a smart move, not just because it's fairly unique, but because of how well it invokes the spirit of the original game's combat. Action RPGs, as a genre, have always been a little mixed. Combining two contrasting genres is a lot easier said than done. What ends up happening is that the action portion ends up mattering more than the strategy side. The reason why this is an issue is that the RPG elements, despite their supposed importance, end up feeling like an afterthought. FF7 Remake is one of the few games that I feel strikes a proper balance between action and RPG. Execution matters just as much as your ability to build effective team compositions. There's enough freedom for skill to overpower strategy, but strategy combined with skill is rewarded heavily. Though all of that hinges on whether or not you find combat efficiency to be a good reward. Where the real source of tension lies isn't so much with the core ideas. Rather, it's in their implementation. For as gung-ho as Square has been about the more action-driven direction of Final Fantasy, it's easy to notice that the company isn't fully confident in going all the way. Cinematic gameplay has been their main goal for years, and while some of their titles have come closer to achieving that than others, no game has fully lived up to that promise. In the case of 7 Remake, its combat issues are rooted in user experience issues, poor conveyance, and inconsistent design. The biggest issue with this game's combat is the battle pacing. Final Fantasy VII Remake has a system where, at the press of a button, you can slow down time and bring up your commands. This allows for players to both catch their breath and to be more precise with their spells. The problem is that this is the only real way to remotely issue commands to your party members. When you're in control of a character, the rest of the party is controlled by AI. They still gain ATB, but none of it is spent without your input. While this is a good idea in the sense that resources aren't automatically invested for you, it creates a disruption in the combat flow when you want to spend ATB. The shortcut menu is only available to your actively controlled character, while everyone else has to rely on the tactical screen. This is fine for the beginning of the game since you're still learning what everything does. But problems begin to surface the more you play. Players will naturally rely less and less on the tactical menu as their skill develops. For the player character, it's a natural progression since you're most likely going to shortcut all of your most used commands. Think attacks like Braver, Focus Thrust, and Counter Stance for Cloud. These are all powerful abilities that you want immediate access to, not just because they're good, but because they're so frequently used that relying on the tactical screen to access them becomes annoyingly clunky. You have to pause the game, select the action, then select the target. The shortcut menu is integral since it turns a 3-step process into a 1-step action. Nothing about the rules change by having this menu available to the player. The only alteration is the speed in which you can access your skills. For the player character, this works perfectly fine and is another source of skill development. However, the problem is that the AI characters can only be controlled through the tactical menu. I never understood why this was the case. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a team-based game. You're supposed to build your team around synergy and coverage. It's impossible to make a single character that can accomplish everything due to the way the materia system works. No matter how you look at it, you're expected to split the load between characters and use their abilities in conjunction with each other. While this does work in a literal sense, the problem is that it feels remarkably unintuitive. If you trap an enemy in a position where you want to wail on them with your best attacks, then you'll be forced to enter a constant stop and start as you quickly open and select commands. It's one of those flaws that compounds on itself as the game progresses. Despite knowing that what you want to accomplish is theoretically possible, it never feels as satisfying as it could because of the interruptions. What blows my mind is that these pace breakers are all artificially built into the battle system. There's no technical limitation preventing Square from letting players access other characters' shortcut menus in real time. In fact, all of the pieces are already there. If you press either of the triggers, you can instantly bring up the tactical menu for the corresponding character. Why not make it so that the triggers instead open up the other party members' shortcut menus? That way, the combat pacing can be kept up even when executing complex strategies. Nothing in the game itself would have to change to make this happen. Really, if Square wanted to, they could keep both options available. Make it so you can access the tactical menu by pressing the A button, and add a remote command option to the triggers. There are quite literally zero downsides to this approach, and it would go a long way in allowing battles to keep up a constant forward pace. While we're at it, I think the camera needs some work too. Just like with the tactical menu, artificial pace breakers were added when switching characters, though this one is a bit more understandable. By default, the camera is extremely close to the action. Since character positioning is mostly out of the player's control, the slight pause when switching active characters is needed to prevent disorientation. There are some settings you can adjust to make the experience more comfortable, but no matter how much you change, that slight pause will always exist. This begs the question as to whether or not this camera was truly the best option for this type of game. A zoomed-out camera is one of the unsung heroes of action combat. While it technically isn't as immersive as being right up in the action, the benefits of seeing everything at once greatly outweighs the drawbacks. If the camera doesn't need to constantly turn and swivel, then the party member switching combat direction can exist without feeling the need to constantly stop and start. This setup would also eliminate moments of off-screen damage, which is a cardinal sin in this type of game. We wouldn't have to get rid of the immersive camera for the exploration either. Keep it behind the back when running around, but switch to a different perspective when fighting things. Though this is one of those requests that's easier said than done, even outside of the logistics of implementing a system like this, players would definitely struggle to accept the idea. Sometimes what's best for the experience might not be something that the players are gonna like. Persona 3, for example, is a game that benefits heavily from its AI-controlled battle system. For years, fans held a disdain towards that commitment, to the point where the Persona 3 remake would go on and gut it out entirely. While this resulted in a less compelling and unique game, it did create an experience that less players would struggle to get into. When you play a modern action game with modern design sensibilities, most people would assume that means the camera would be locked behind the player. When the industry shows favoritism towards specific control styles, camera settings, and even UI layouts, they start to become the standard. If a handful of ultra-successful projects feature specific, replicatable elements, it suddenly becomes expected that your own product will be cut from the same cloth. It's why shooter controls have been unchanged for years. Experimentation, especially when the idea is foreign, isn't celebrated in the way others might expect you to believe. I can assure you that if Square did in fact adopt a pull-out camera like I suggested, then the game would sell less and get worse ratings, even if it was the better option. Speaking of cynicism, pop quiz, why are there so many sliding sections? You're wrong, it's because they wanted the game to be longer. The biggest issue with this game's battle system, though, isn't the pace breakers or even the camera. The real problem is that the combat of the Final Fantasy VII Remake feels designed with a specific gameplay scenario in mind, but the literal content it's featured in is at odds with that directly. To put it more bluntly, this game is a lot more fun during mini-bosses and longer fights than it is during traditional random battles. With the way the ATB system works, how attacks can be used to your advantage, and what the ultimate meta goal is during each encounter, it's clear that the majority of combat was designed around fights that last longer than 30 seconds. This game rewards tempo and early starts greatly. Hovering between 1 to 2 ATB bars gives you the chance to respond to any action coming your way, and there's a lot of fun in pushing your luck. Counter stance is one of the most fun techniques in the game because of the inherent risk that comes with the ability. That ideal ATB range works well in longer fights, but not as much in the shorter ones. Most random encounters aren't worth deep investments or ask for complex strategies. It's similar to the original game in that regard, but the core difference is intent. The original FF7 uses turn-based mechanics, a system that's easier to balance for multiple scenarios than Remake's more dynamic combat. It's not very difficult to set up a compelling turn-based enemy table due to how matter-of-fact battles are in that setting. Want to make a random encounter interesting? Just change who's featured in it. Want to make a boss? Just add some extra layers like elemental affinity and a wider attack pool. It's the same core gameplay that you're used to, just applied in a different context. In the remake, it's more challenging to make satisfying random fights, since the game's core systems play on ideas much more fitting to longer fights. The whole point of the game is building up enemy stagger and kicking them while they're down. This would be exhausting if featured in every fight, so understandably, it's usually reserved for the deadlier foes. The problem is that we're now leaving out an important component in the standard battles. Since attacks are all designed with specific use cases in mind, they no longer have a home in short standoffs. That's not even mentioning just how powerful a single ATB bar can be in random fights. First Strike is probably the best materia in the game because of how ever useful its presence is. When this thing is fully maxed out, you start off every fight with nearly 2 full ATB bars. Having an immediate head start like that destroys the balance. It would be like if in the original FF7, your team had the initiative in every fight. Getting to pull out strong attacks before enemies even get the chance to establish a game plan cripples whatever the intended challenge was. You might take some pot shots, but it's never enough to be a threat unless you just refuse to heal in between fights for some reason. The trade-off to using First Strike is that you're giving up a potentially useful materia slot, but I struggle to think of any I would replace this one with. There's no reason to spec my characters around weaknesses and stagger because the random fights go down so fast. And it's impossible to outright fix it without making drastic changes to the design. An RPG needs to have relaxation fights. Not every battle should be the ultimate test between life or death. Sometimes smaller tests of skill can work well as a pace breaker. Remake's core combat doesn't allow for that without outright removing complexity. It's difficult for me to remember most of the random encounters in this game because of how easy it is to fall back on certain strategies. Enter the fight, build up ATB as fast as possible, and just use your strongest attack to win. It works surprisingly often, and is less forgivable in an action RPG than it is a turn-based one. Where this game undoubtedly shines brighter than the original is in the different playable characters. One of the most common criticisms of the classic game is that every party member basically plays the same. While they do have some differences between them that might guide you towards specific playstyles, what really mattered was their materia. FF7 Remake tackles this problem head-on, and uses its new identity as an action game to make the most out of the opportunity. On top of every character having different statistical priorities over each other, each party member also has their own unique action that sets them apart. For example, Tifa is an all-out brawler. She specializes in self-buffing, and her unique action changes depending on her buff level. Tifa can be absolutely disgusting in the hands of the right player, doubly so if you build her to take advantage of specific strategies. On top of this, every character also has their own set of weapons to play around with. What's cool is that weapons have a little more going on than just raw stats. Each weapon specializes in a specific role in combat and can be further upgraded to improve its stats, number of materia slots, and even add specialized combat abilities. Weapons can alter a character's role in combat in rather significant ways. While it's not enough to outright replace a character's identity in battle, you can nudge them towards specific ideas. One of my favorite strategies was to give Tifa the purple pain weapon, time magic, and an accessory that extends the duration of debuffs. With this, it's possible to set up stop loops, where you can outright deny enemies the opportunity to recover from stagger while bringing in the pain. Every character has niche options like this thanks to their weapons, and while some are definitely better than others, nearly all of them have their own special use cases. And for Barret, his weapons have the potential to outright change his function in combat. I actually prefer playing as melee Barret over the regular guy. His big sweeping attacks and charge move can demolish lesser baddies while also being incredibly fun. I don't hate playing as ranged characters in this combat system, but they are undoubtedly less interesting. Aerith and Barret are extremely important characters to have in this type of game. That ranged coverage pulls a lot of weight. Their unique abilities also provide fantastic support options. The problem I have is that their literal combat is very uninvolved. Using ranged attacks doesn't come with the same satisfying feedback as smacking dudes with a sword does. It's another reason why I'd like there to be an option to issue remote commands without stopping the flow of combat. Let me have that utility without forcing boring gameplay on me. The last playable character in the game is Yuffie. I wasn't too sure when to talk about Intermission, so I may as well get the most important stuff out of the way. Intermission was a piece of DLC released not too long after the original game. Its main purpose is to showcase the gameplay ideas and systems that could potentially show up in the future remakes. Believe it or not, I still haven't played Rebirth, so Intermission is my introduction to Yuffie's playstyle, and holy shit is she just broken. Yuffie is a special character, not just because she specializes in mixed attacks, but because a lot of her built-in combat options negate the need for specific materia. Yuffie's ninjutsu lets her change the properties of her ranged damage to any of the 4 standard elements. Because of this, Yuffie's playstyle differs dramatically from the rest. She's able to exploit most weaknesses by herself, so her loadout might lean towards support. This doesn't mean she's lacking in stopping power, however, since Yuffie can easily be the most aggressive character in the game. Her shuriken has basically unlimited range, and can easily combo with specific skills to create powerful ranged attacks. Yuffie's also tethered to her weapon, so at the press of a button, you can instantly zip across the screen to get up close and personal. It doesn't take long to realize that this technique basically acts as a better version of Noctis's Warp Strike, which, might I remind you, is the dude's entire identity. She's got an invincible teleport, a massive area of effect attack, and is the only character in the game with a perfect block feature. The real creme de la creme is her synergy mode with this dude named Sinon. While you don't directly control Alex Lee, you can sync his actions with Yuffie's at the press of a button. Not only does this double the amount of damage you're dealing, but it also changes the property of a handful of Yuffie's attacks. The purpose of this DLC is to be an advertisement of Yuffie's character and gameplay experience. Because of this, the design is noticeably less polished this time around. The best way to convince players to pick up a different playstyle is for them to find a reason to abandon the one they're used to. What this means is that Yuffie's gameplay is a lot more style over substance. It's focused heavily on the animation feedback and particle effects. And while this does lend this piece of content a theme park-like experience, it's lacking the depth the main game has on offer, and unfortunately further highlights the issues I take with aspects of this game's design. I wasn't expecting a fully fleshed out experience with this one, considering the time it was released. But it's not hard to notice the flaws in retrospect. Yuffie and Sinon's synergy mode is something that can be relied on without too much consequence. Against a single opponent, it's impossible for them to deal with the overwhelming pressure. Doubly so if you time your synergy activations during a floor bounce. It's entirely possible to stunlock specific enemies just by mashing the attack button. I didn't think Square Enix would take notes from Marvel vs. Capcom 3 with the unblockable high-low setups, but considering Yuffie can quite literally do Dr. Doom's foot dive spam, I shouldn't have expected anything less. I want to reserve my full thoughts on Yuffie's gameplay for when I get around to Rebirth, but my first impressions are strong, provided Square is willing to accommodate for the insane level of power she has on offer. I can imagine that every character got a slight rework in the sequel, and my only hope is that the design takes that newfound power into account. Remake Part 1 already has a pretty decent balance, all things considered. Normal mode offers a decent challenge for a first-timer, while hard mode adds a few extra restrictions to shake up the experience. Though Rebirth places itself in a more complicated scenario. Remake benefits from having predetermined party members. You don't get to pick and choose who you want to use outside of tournament settings. This means the designers can build challenges with less variables to account for. Rebirth featuring more characters along with more variables in combat will force the developers into making tough calls. I don't envy the position, but I am excited to see how that will end up playing out in the end. That positive statement right there should signal where I stand on this combat system. On the whole, I find this new direction to be fun, but flawed. It manages to capture similar feelings to the original game where it counts, but also introduces enough compelling ideas of its own. The materia system was basically unchanged in terms of function, each character has a distinct playstyle that sets them apart, and the difficulty is consistent enough for tougher battles to actually require strategy. Strangely, the combat's cracks become more obvious not through the way core mechanics function, rather the flaws are obvious when featured in specific types of battles. It's a bit hard to overlook just how shallow some of the non-boss encounters can be, considering just how prevalent they are. Certain issues that might seem small end up impacting the experience heavily due to their innate inclusion. The unfortunate truth being that those bumps can't be smoothed out without a lot of changes. Though, for a first crack at this new direction of Final Fantasy combat, I think there's more good than bad. It's hard to think of other outcomes for a Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat that don't involve fully diving into one of the extremes. Either Square would fully commit to the new direction or stay with what people were used to. I'm glad that they used the opportunity to try something actually worthwhile instead of some cynical approach. As for whether or not this combat should be the standard for upcoming Final Fantasy games is something that could be debated. This approach works well here because it's a remake intentionally trying to harken back to a classic game. A totally original project would most likely end up going in a different direction. I mean, we already saw this happen with Final Fantasy XVI. While I do appreciate that they didn't outright reuse Remake's combat, part of me wonders if the game would have been better overall with it. That's just speculation though. What matters now is that FF7 Remake's gameplay is surprisingly solid, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it's evolved and improved in Rebirth. I don't think I'm being unreasonable with my requests, so there's a chance that they'll be addressed. This isn't an invitation for you to spoil that for me either. The combat is the best part about this game, for better and for worse.
Huh. Didn't know you were holding down the fort.
Huh? Oh, hey, Cloud. Looking to join the Neighborhood Watch?
That depends. What does this Neighborhood Watch do?
When it was revealed that the Final Fantasy VII Remake would be a 3-part affair, I was extremely skeptical. Not just because it signaled that the story as we knew it would be drastically different, but because I was wondering how each part would justify its own existence when it came to the content and level design. It's no secret that Midgar in the original Final Fantasy VII was essentially a 5-hour tutorial. It's one of gaming's most beloved and recognized prologues in history. Most of this has to do with just how well paced the experience was. 5 hours sounds like a long investment, but it flies by in a flash thanks to the amazing pacing, interesting story, and fun characters. The prospect of taking such a tightly knit opening and stretching it to its absolute limit is both intriguing and worrying. The optimist in me wanted to only see the good in this decision. Before this, we only got to see a small slice of the Midgar experience. Our time in the city was limited solely to the slums of sectors 5 through 8. It was enough to paint a picture of the world and what it's like living there, but not enough to justify spending more time than we did within the walls. Since the remake was already looking to expand on the story and characters, I was hopeful that Midgar itself would have gotten the same treatment. Maybe instead of seeing only a little bit of the slums, we could explore everything. Side missions could involve us going topside and taking care of contract work. Maybe new story elements could be added to further flesh out and justify the time spent here. Well, I was only half right on this train of thought, because we did get some new content here, but not as much as I hoped. Instead of adding brand new areas to extend the game, Square opted to extend visits that otherwise were short and sweet. The Sector 5 reactor raid was originally like 5 minutes long. You ran through the train station, went under the plates, found the reactor, and boom bang bop, bye bye Cloud! While that same structure still exists in the remake, the difference is that the mission is much more involved this time. Each section has been expanded upon greatly, featuring a handful of mini-bosses, dungeon gimmicks, and even the occasional optional goodie to find. Pretty much every screen from the classic Midgar has been fleshed out and expanded into these labyrinthian mazes. On one hand, it's impressive to see the abstract finally become more tangible. As fictitious as the idea of a company-sponsored city seems, Square pulls off the setting with so much confidence that you'll almost believe a place like this could really exist. This game looks great, and while the realistic art direction isn't for everyone, I think it fits the tone of the story well. The problem is that Square has an obsession with immersion, and when combined with a game whose entire goal is to take a 5-hour prologue and turn it into a 40-hour journey, I think you can see the issue. FF7 Remake feels almost insecure about its own runtime. It's to the degree where most extensions to the story and levels feel artificial. Usually an idea is introduced, and instead of it just being a one-off gimmick, it ends up being repeated and stretched to its limit. To use the same example as earlier, the journey to the Sector 5 reactor is significantly longer than in the original game. The way this is achieved is by taking what should be a one-op diversion and turning it into the main method of traversal. In order to break into the reactor, you need to divert enough power from these sun lamps to a different generator so this platform can move. This transforms what should be an inoffensive case of padding into a large gap of repetitive gameplay. No new ideas are introduced to keep the goal from getting stale. There's no difference between turning off one generator as opposed to disabling the entire power grid. It's the same task and formula, just more of it. This might seem like a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things, but let me assure you that padding like this exists all over the game. It can take the form of splitting what should be one task into multiple steps, intentionally slowing down movement, or forcing the player to experience every little bit of fluff dialogue as possible. Its effectiveness varies greatly depending on the moment in the story you're in. I actually don't mind the slower paced scenes when they're placed after long stretches of action. It allows time for players to recover and let the impact of the previous events fully set in. It's for this reason why I don't mind the inclusion of hub areas and side quests. There's about 30 side quests total, and while they aren't the greatest pieces of content in the world, I do find that they are worth doing. Whether that be because it actually offers something worthwhile in a gameplay sense, or comes with a good reward. In my FF16 critique, I called out the game for being focused on quantity over quality. That game featured about 80 side missions, but almost all of them were cut from the same cloth. FF7 Remake in comparison has way less, and because of this, they are on average higher quality. There's certainly a handful of filler missions here that don't ask much out of the player mechanically, but those ones tend to focus on the character interactions instead, which is valuable for an RPG. The best side quests in the game are the ones that ask you to fight unique enemies. I'm thinking of the set introduced in Chapter 14. Enemies like the Tonberry and Behemoth aren't featured in the main campaign at all, so I appreciate that Square found a home for them in some capacity. These enemies ended up being a lot of fun to fight, since they make full use out of the game's combat mechanics. The same compliment can be extended to the arena battles too. There's a lot of optional fights in this game against a wide variety of enemy formations. You're even challenged to take on tasks with specific characters. You're heavily encouraged to do these too, since it's the host to some of the best equipment and materia in the game. Though if you don't care, you can always skip past this stuff. But I get the feeling that Square doesn't want you to do that. Not just because it's content that they put time and money into, but because if you only focus on the main stuff, then Remake is a remarkably short game. It's honestly shocking just how much time can be shaved off if you simply go from start to finish without stopping to smell the Mako-infused roses. It's for this reason that I expect why downtime was added in the main content. Those moments where you slowly shimmy between cracks or swing across monkey bars are primarily there solely for the sake of extending the runtime. Ever since people realized that elevators are sometimes used to disguise loading screens, people have adopted this armchair developer mindset. If there's downtime, then it must be because of technical limitations. While that might have been true in the past, I sincerely doubt FF7 Remake uses all of these sections for the sake of loading. There might be an extreme amount of detail, but it's also an incredibly dense game. There's already tricks at work here to help streamline the loading process too. Take a shot whenever you notice a pre-rendered backdrop. Though, don't be surprised if you end that challenge thinking the remake looks exactly like the OG title. Converting segments like the Midgar sewer and abandoned train stations into full-fledged areas is also a smart idea, and for the most part, it works well. But again, there are some inclusions in here that obviously only exist for the sake of adding extra game time, instead of being a stimulating experience. The most egregious example of padding has gotta be the second sewer visit in Chapter 14. Just before you're allowed to make your way to the Shinra building, you're forced to do a bunch of busy work for one of Don Corneo's lackeys. This entire stretch of the game is ultimately meaningless to the grand scheme of the experience, and exists solely because Square didn't think the game was long enough. This portion is especially sloppy, and is home to the most frustrating moment in the experience, all because Leslie forgot how to open a goddamn door. Even when looking at this game in a vacuum without the context of the original, moments like these stand out as being a massive waste of time. Remake is filled with a lot of empty calories, and is in desperate need of some fat trimming. The root of the problem, though, stems from this game's intention of being just one part of a much larger journey. This sounds easy to achieve on paper, but in practice is much more delicate of a task than anyone at Square could have expected. Each game needs to feel like its own fully fledged journey that's satisfying to experience on its own, while simultaneously being a piece in a much larger puzzle. It's the equivalent of remaking a painting, where instead of using one canvas, you use 3. This offers its own benefits, like having the opportunity to admire the fine detail, but when taken in its totality like it should be, those small additions ultimately blend into the composition. It makes you wonder whether or not it was even worth it to add all of this extra stuff if it doesn't make the end product better. This approach also forces developers to make changes to the game design and structure so it ends up feeling good on its own, even if it misrepresents what Final Fantasy VII was trying to be. The best example of this is with the new wall market. In the original game, the wall market was this shady shithole that was the home to most of Midgar's crime. A fun getaway for the overworked on the outside, but a seedy operation just outside of the public eye. The original game presented the wall market with that direction in mind. The diners are packed to the brim with opportunistic scumbags, the streets are littered with salespeople trying to take advantage of naivety, and there's no doubt that the Honeybee Inn is probably the last place you'd want to be. If that doesn't say everything you need to know, then let me just point out that the song that plays in this area is called The Oppressed. In Remake, the wall market had a complete makeover. It leans more into the fun getaway side than it does the criminal side. There's bright lights, colorful characters, and music that sounds like it came right out of a carnival. It's a very different feeling area compared to the original game, and that attitude goes against the criminal empire theme that the original had. Though I don't think this change was made because Square didn't get it. Rather, it's different because this portion of the remake is supposed to be the fun mini-game jokey section to break up the misery and seriousness. The original FF7 does something like this too, and it's even introduced around the same point in the experience that Remake does. The big difference is that the gold saucer was completely separate from Midgar's misery and is more believable because of it. The wall market in Remake keeps the same story urgency that was featured before, but the experience inside the town doesn't match it anymore. So what do? Either you keep the wall market the same and you don't have those moments of levity anymore, or you change it and create a much more palatable experience, but at the cost of intentionally defying the original intention. I don't think remakes should always be forced to do exactly what the old does. There's value in experimenting and trying new things. And if there's something that the Final Fantasy VII Remake is more than comfortable with, it would be that stance against the familiar.
Gonna have to ask you to leave now. This here's a private affair.
Part of me finds it ironic just how much reverence there is towards storytelling in video games. Considering the main draw of the activity is the interaction, I find it a bit strange how remakes are forbidden from touching the narrative side of the coin. This remake should update this, change that, but keep the story the same. It's a bit funny, but I understand why. Unlike video game mechanics, storytelling is usually seen as timeless. Final Fantasy VII is a product of its time in many ways. The visuals, gameplay mechanics, and even basic narrative beats were all shaped by the culture that surrounded the project. However, its methods of delivering its narrative aren't all that different than something like a book or movie. The graphics never held back 7's storytelling to any noticeable degree. You still get the intended emotions out of the experience, and the cinematography is legitimately effective even almost 30 years later. When people were begging for a remake of this game, I'm sure most of them wanted to keep as much as that original story as they could. While I don't find there to be much artistic value in doing the exact same thing again, I understand the appeal of seeing iconic moments recreated with modern technology. It works well as a showcase of what more original titles could look like, while also providing a refreshing update to the familiar. The simple addition of voice acting can elevate a scene well above what was possible back in the 90s. There is merit to doing this, but the problem is that a divide between developers and players now exists. The Final Fantasy VII that I know might not match the interpretation the developers have. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if there's one thing art is known for, it would be how individuals come to different conclusions on the same topic based on real-life experiences. When you take something as abstract as a PS1 RPG and try to polish it and add detail, you might end up making a different painting than the one people remember. Whether or not this is a positive or negative will vary depending on what your creative goals are. The best that you can hope for when playing a remake is that the staff see the same vision you do. If their vision doesn't match yours, then it's tempting to say that they missed the point of it all. Unless we get access to the design documents, it's impossible to know what Final Fantasy VII was supposed to be. Even then, games are made by people with limited time and resources. The FF7 that fans know is a compromised version of what the developers wanted, and whether they like it or not, that's the Final Fantasy VII that we ended up with. Changing much of anything of that game will result in a drastically different experience. Because of this, I appreciate Square for just diving headfirst into making a different feeling game. The announcement of this being a multi-part saga was a declaration that things were going to be different this time around. Though I'm not so sure if anyone was expecting the direction Square would ultimately go in. While the general premise and what happens during the Midgar chapters is essentially unchanged from a literal standpoint, the context and meaning behind it all is completely different. This is the largest source of contention between fans of the old and new. How much you enjoy this game's narrative hinges on whether or not you're willing to accept that this game is trying to be different from the original. Once you overcome that hurdle and are willing to accept the weird and new ideas, then I actually think what 7 Remake is going for is kind of clever. Though the implementation leaves a lot to be desired. Let's start off with the good. When Final Fantasy VII Remake is just trying to be an expanded take on the original game's story, it's very well done. Scenes are recreated with a lot of care and attention. Small animations that gave the PS1 game its charm are occasionally referenced in tasteful ways. Going the extra mile like this does a lot for someone like me. It demonstrates that the people behind the project genuinely approached the cutscenes from more than one angle, and really considered why people were invested to begin with. The new voice cast also elevates the material to a high-quality standard. No line has an awkward read, characters all have believable performances, and as simple as it is, I just like the way the voices match the models. Simple additions and changes can sometimes be impactful enough for a character to go from forgettable to surprisingly resonant. Sector 7's Avalanche crew got probably the best glow-up. In the original game, this team was mostly a throwaway force. They worked with you once and died not too long after that. Their purpose was to die, which sounds kind of fucked up, but it was an effective way to show just how corrupt the Shinra organization is. Since the first part of the remake was dedicated solely to the Midgar section, Square decided to do the smart thing and develop these minor characters more. Biggs was given extreme paranoia and anxiety, which is a lot more relatable than I'd like to admit. Wedge has a love for food and all things feline related, and Jessie became the single most down bad character in Final Fantasy. Okay, there's more than that, but they really play up her attraction towards Cloud. Some might even call it a bit overbearing, but I think this added flirtatious edge gives Jessie a much stronger personality to attach to. I only wish that her personal life was explored a little bit more. There are hints of a tragic past and how Shinra's negligence resulted in Jessie being forced to give up her dream, but it doesn't go much further beyond being a footnote. The more fleshed out personalities lends Avalanche a much stronger bond than they had before. Let's be real, who were these people in the original game? They had a minor role in the story and were ultimately forgotten about by the players once they left Midgar. When you're given very little to work with, it's okay to take some liberties. I doubt anyone is legitimately upset that Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie are slightly different in the remake. What people were more worried about was the portrayal of the main characters, specifically Cloud and Aerith. It's no secret that the compilation of Final Fantasy VII is extremely mixed. For every good idea, there was one that failed to stick the landing, one of which was the characterization of the main cast. While I will excuse the more sorrow-filled take on the characters in Advent Children specifically, that energy unfortunately found its way into other Final Fantasy projects. The Cloud in Kingdom Hearts is much closer to the moody and depressed man he would later become, rather than the somewhat awkward and dorky kid that the original game was going for. This even applies to Dissidia, where accurate character personalities was kind of the appeal. Though I think Aerith got the worst treatment, transforming from a character with a personality and energy to this messiah-like figure. It was almost as if she was banned from being interesting. This is why Remake felt like a proper return to form. People were getting tired of the melodramatic direction the characters took, and it's nice to be reminded that these people are allowed to feel something other than misery. This is the best Cloud and the gang have been in a very long time, and thanks to the new level of detail brought with current technology, subtle storytelling can now be introduced. I know that might sound like a bit of a far-fetched claim considering I'm talking about a Square Enix title, but trust me, these types of details exist everywhere. Whether it be in the softness introduced to Cloud's voice when he's talking alone with Tifa, or the way eye contact can be used to communicate true emotion beneath the facade the characters force themselves to wear. When Remake uses its technology not to rewrite history, but to add to it, that's when the game is at its best. Every so often does Remake feel like a perfect update to the original. The small section where Cloud and Aerith run across the rooftops was almost magical because of it. It communicates the same emotion, but in a slightly different, yet refreshing way. Not a replacement for that old scene, but a nice complement to such a memorable moment. When Final Fantasy VII Remake is focused on being that old game, then I think Square nails it more often than they don't. Though sometimes the odd change ends up being extremely distracting. I don't like how they changed Shinra's involvement with the Avalanche cause. In the original game, Avalanche was an extremist group willing to potentially destroy the lives of innocent people to highlight their cause. Ultimately, this ends up being a small part of the story that's mostly used as a comparison point of Barrett's character growth. I was hoping that the remake would fully dive into the confusing emotions and guilt that comes with these controversial actions. They do this a little bit with Jessie, but it ultimately ends up falling flat. This is because it's revealed early on that the reactor destruction was caused by Shinra. They wanted to weaponize the eco-terrorist group by making it look like they intended to deal more damage than they did. Changes like this end up causing more harm than good, I think. It's almost as if Square was anxious that the first-time players would end up feeling disgusted with Barrett's decisions if he was solely responsible for the outcome. Having Shinra manipulate events to serve a greater narrative silently exonerates Barrett of the responsibility that comes with being a leader. It's an opportunity to point at the screen and say, well, it's actually Shinra's fault that all this destruction happened, instead of dealing with the uncomfortable realities that comes with extremists. You'd think that making Barrett such a likable and loving father would be enough for this situation to feel conflicting. Barrett is supposed to show the dangers of activism, on top of the unfortunate truth that sometimes good people might have to do bad things to bring about change. Having all of the outcomes be firmly Barrett's responsibility makes his character more layered than giving players an easy out with Shinra. I like the idea of the general public taking firm stances on Avalanche and their actions, and it's realistic to show how media can be used to bend the truth. But I think it was enough to have Shinra claim Avalanche worked with Wutai instead of feeling the need to cause that destruction themselves. It would also demonstrate the raw competence this company's PR team has. If that sounds too political for this game, then I'm sorry, but you're playing Final Fantasy VII. Another change I struggle to say I'm fully on board with is the much larger presence of the extended FF7 universe. On one hand, it's cool to see that the compilation is treated with more reverence than just being an awkward expansion. For as mixed as the entirety of that project was, it's hard to deny that there are a handful of cool ideas in there. I'm thinking stuff like Zack's personality development. But what I'm not the biggest fan of is when completely pointless characters are added to the remake solely for fan service. Yeah, as you might guess, I don't really care about Leslie or Kyrie. Both of these characters are from a Japanese exclusive story about the Turks, and while it's cool that such an obscure piece of FF7 gets represented here, they don't add enough to justify their inclusion. At best, they're forgettable NPCs that serve a single purpose, and at worst, they almost feel like advertisements. I'm not the biggest fan of when story elements are included just because fans would recognize them. Every character, plot beat, and line of dialogue should be assisting the overall message that's being pushed in some way or another. What do Leslie and Kyrie's inclusion tell us about Midgar that wasn't already explored through other heroes and villains? Not a whole lot, and because of that, I think we'd be better off without them. Man, I've been talking for a while. My throat is killing me. Let me just get some water real quick.
These would, of course, include S and G types. Quite frankly, there's no telling what kind of properties that...
G-types? Vice? Deep Ground? Dirge of Cerberus? Oh no! Okay, so this stuff comes from Dirge of Cerberus, a PS2 action game starring the ever-popular Vincent Valentine. Wildly considered to be the worst part about FF7's story, Deep Ground was this secret faction of soldier that only the top-ranked in Shinra knew about, all being led by this guy named Vice. They were essentially a group of nihilists that sought to destroy the world the moment they were awakened. They weren't the most compelling group of villains in the world, and acted as a vessel for Hojo to continue being the worst person alive even in his death. On one hand, I think it's kinda cool that the remake decided to throw a bone to the people who legitimately remember and care about these characters. But on the other, Deep Ground's inclusion is one of the most out of place and distracting additions made to the remakes. Not just because these characters come from a pretty bad story, all things considered, but because it ironically takes away from the idea of this being an FF7 remake. When people ask for a remake of Final Fantasy VII, they weren't talking about all this garbage. I don't want to take a firm stance on whether their implementation was good or bad just yet. While I find it super distracting to be featured in Remake Part 1 at all, regardless of the bulk of it being tied to DLC, I have no idea how this will affect the overarching story that Remake wants to tell. And really, that's the source of my criticism with all these compilation references. Adding characters that didn't exist in the original story risks muddying what we came here for. I wanted to see the story of Final Fantasy VII, but remade and adapted in modern day, and most of that is because it didn't feature any of the nonsense that came after. If there's a bright side to the compilation, it's that it can be ignored pretty easily if you don't like it. Putting it front and center in the remakes just reminds me of the direction that FF7 eventually took. And if it's being featured in the remake at all, then you know for a fact that it's going to be more than just a one-time thing. I don't know, I'd find it pretty distracting if while running through the Northern Crater in the final game, we have to stop and fucking fight Nero or whatever. Either you pretend that these characters don't exist and make their introduction really distracting, or you make them a core part of the game and confuse the original story with the remake's interests. It's difficult to talk about the overall quality of the narrative featured across the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. The two paths one can take when discussing it is judging it as a standalone experience, or as a single part in a much larger saga. What's interesting is that your conclusion on the overall quality of these narratives changes drastically depending on the lens you examine it from. Since we don't have all three parts of the puzzle just yet, I want to save any and all discussion about the experience as a trilogy until after it's finished. What I'm more interested in doing is looking at how this portion of the remake stands on its own 2 feet. With that criteria in mind, it should be easy to justify my opinions on the meta-narrative. It's no secret by now that Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't just interested in retelling the same story as fans know. Sure, it might look similar, follow the general structure, and even end at familiar points. But how we got there, what is said and done, and the real meaning behind these events is completely different. And the source of that comes from Sephiroth and the Whispers. To make a long story short, it's heavily implied that the Sephiroth we see throughout the Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't the Genova clones from before. Rather, it's theorized that this Sephiroth is from a different timeline, that he somehow found a way to travel to another world after being absorbed into the life stream. It's clear that Sephiroth is operating on a different level of knowledge than the audience and characters have. For Cloud, this forces him to directly question his sanity, continually priming him to participate in that Genova reunion theory. Though for the player, this just means Sephiroth drops the odd, "you can't save anyone" line. I feel like a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand Sephiroth's appeal and why he worked as well as he does. And no, it doesn't have to do with the mystery surrounding the character. Believe it or not, we actually knew everything we needed to know about Sephiroth and his motivations not too long after he becomes relevant to the story. President Shinra's assassination is immediately followed by the Nibelheim flashback, then the Junon ship confrontation right after that. Sephiroth wasn't exactly a mystery in the original game. However, his presence was certainly more powerful there than it is here. This is because whenever Sephiroth did appear in the original game, it was to serve a much greater purpose, either to manipulate players into following him, or dramatically altering the state of events to an irreparable degree. The reason why people remember Sephiroth as much as they do is because there's never any wasted time with him. The remake has a much trickier balancing act to uphold due to the direction the story takes. I understand why Sephiroth was included in FF7 Remake at all. He's like the most popular character in the game, so it's very difficult to imagine any form of a remake, multi-part or not, that outright excludes him. I don't think it's inherently a bad thing for the character to make brief appearances as long as it's framed correctly. You gotta remember, the Nibelheim incident is a very traumatic moment. And since Cloud already has tremendous mental health issues due to his inferiority complex, I can see that manifesting in a trauma response. The problem isn't that Sephiroth shows up early. The issue is that it either doesn't matter much, or the meaning behind his words are so vague that there's no tangible reason to care about what he's even saying. All of this is meant to lead to Remake's defining story elements. Every so often, when the story threatens to go a little bit off course, these spectrals show up to prevent that from happening. For example, if a character who wasn't destined to die in the story finds themselves to be in a life or death situation, then the Whispers will intervene to keep the planet's natural order in place. This is honestly a pretty interesting idea, especially for a remake. Final Fantasy VII has one of the most beloved stories ever made, and one of the most popular requests for it was to stay the exact same. Instead of just doing the same thing again as everyone wanted, Square decided to make fan expectations a literal narrative device. The Whispers are meant to be the fans like you and me, the ones that have an ideal fate that we wish to see carried out no matter what. These arbiters of fate are presented as an obstacle in the story because that's just how the creative team feels in this situation. They feel as if they're forced to follow a predetermined path, and that defying it is a futile effort. Doing what you want versus what's expected of you is so much more complicated than the way people frame it. It's easy to say, just be yourself, but that doesn't put food on the table. Getting people invested in the story and keeping them coming back for more is what Square wanted out of this trilogy. And when looking at the decisions from that perspective, I understand why they went the route that they did. As much as people hate to admit it, I don't think this trilogy would be able to survive without the inclusion of some weird controversial element like this. Think of it this way, if you were to do a one-to-one adaptation of the original FF7, how many people do you think would stick around for Part 2 and eventually 3? Honestly, not as many as you think. In fact, each part's respective success hinges on what portion of the story gets adapted. If I hear that Part 2 goes from Calm to the Forgotten City of the Ancients, then I already have a good enough idea of what story scenes will be included. At that point, my decision to play that game will be determined by my desire to see those scenes updated. If I don't care about that portion of the game, then I just skip it. While you yourself might be willing to play all of them as they're coming out, the general public certainly isn't, especially if there's going to be such large gaps between releases. Having this meta-narrative element with the promise of the story taking a radically different direction is more interesting than just doing the same thing, but again. With the hook they introduced here, I'm more willing to check out the later games. Sure, there's going to be stuff that I already know, there's just too much money to be made not to include it, but the curiosity of what will change might just be enough to get me to buy in. That's why Remake is structured the way that it is, and if that sounds like a cynical read, I don't disagree, but it is most likely the truth. As someone already sold on the idea of altering aspects of the story to fit this new format, I don't really care about the Whisper's inherent inclusion. I don't find their presence to be this blasphemous idea that many fans do, because Final Fantasy VII already has a bunch of weird mysticism in it. This is a game where the planet creates multiple kaiju to protect itself against hostile alien life. The lifeblood of the planet directly ties into the spirit of the people and allows them to enter the subconscious of others. The planet is very much alive in this story, and it's not exactly unreasonable for it to have some sort of failsafe that keeps it alive as long as possible. The real problem with this whole alternate Sephiroth and Whispers plotline isn't the idea, it's the way it was included and incorporated into the story. What Final Fantasy VII Remake wants to say is that life isn't set in stone. There will always be expectations placed on you that you're meant to follow, even if it doesn't lead you to the happiness that you deserve. That's why, instead of blindly following destiny, we should instead defy it and take our lives back into our hands. The problem with this message is that the literal story of the game doesn't commit to any changes, and we end up in the exact same place that we're supposed to be in by the end of it. We start with the bombing mission, meet Aerith, Sector 7 falls, and by the end of it, the characters decide to leave Midgar behind because Sephiroth stands as a massive threat to the world. So if this game is all about defying what's expected out of you, then why the fuck does it end where we all thought it would? I can already hear it now.
That's what the sequels are for. This game was supposed to set the stage for future ones to bring about the real change.
I had this exact same mindset when I first played this game all those years ago. But as I get older, I start to lose confidence in that stance. If the Whispers are such an important detail to this story and the meaning behind it, then I think Square fucked up in their implementation pretty horribly. Firstly, what's considered a key event worth preserving and what can realistically change is inconsistent. So Cloud has to go on the second bombing mission so he can meet Aerith, right? In this version of the story, he ends up getting passed on for this job, so the Whispers decide to injure Jessie so that Cloud now has to go with them. Okay, that makes sense. Cloud and Aerith meeting each other matters so much to the planet that it does everything in its power to make that happen. But what about the people that died during the Sector 7 collapse? If Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge were all supposed to die that night, how come Biggs is allowed to live? The Whispers put in so much work to track down Wedge and supposedly kill him, why ignore Biggs? Is it because he's unconscious and not doing anything that meaningfully changes the world? How come Yuffie is allowed to see Deep Ground and fight Nero? She never knew about that in Dirge of Cerberus, and if she did, don't you think she would have told someone about it? The game never establishes a threshold for change, and it makes the Whispers feel like they don't follow any rules. Is a personality difference between the original and remake considered big enough to change the course of the story? How come Leslie is allowed to be here when he didn't exist before? Who the fuck is this Roche guy? How come the Whispers didn't come in contact with Cloud during the factory raid he originally wasn't a part of? It's moments like these that make the world confusing. Secondly, the game does a horrible job at making this plot element feel earned. There's very little build up to the Whispers. The reveal of their nature and purpose is just randomly dropped on us at the start of Chapter 17. While they do make sparse appearances before this, that's not the same as being properly foretold in the plot. Aside from the odd mention of destiny and fate, there's almost nothing in the game itself that ties into this theme. There's never a point where destiny is defied and it has meaningful impact. It makes me wonder what's even the point of all this if we're just going to do the same thing that we already know. Why are you threatening to make this a cool and distinct version of the story instead of just making a cool and distinct version of the story? By doing it the way the finished game handles it, all it screams to me is that Square lacked the confidence in what they wanted to change. The Whispers come off less as a commentary of fan expectations, and more so an excuse that can be used to justify why things are different, as if making any change needs to have fan approval before they could be implemented. Do you know what would have been so much better? If Square instead decided to just change what didn't work and let the results speak for themselves. If they wanted to go in a different direction, that's their choice, and it's up to them to justify it. The best way to do that is by making something great, not by dangling the opportunity for greatness in front of us. If you're already making such a big deal about the story being different, then just make it different in ways that are appropriate. It's why I like the Avalanche changes and not the ones done to the final act. There's another layer to all this that not many people discuss. Even though this is one chapter in a larger story, this game, on its own, needs to have a satisfying conclusion. How do you do that for the Midgar section without introducing a new idea? I think the Whispers mostly exist to justify this game having a final boss that's not this asshole here. If people are bothered by the pacing, then you can just look at the final act and try to rationalize that it's all worth it in the end. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, but only time can tell on that front. In the now, what we have is a story that wants to be more than it is, but doesn't have the confidence to explore those ideas without ditching the main selling point. Whether Square likes it or not, this is a Final Fantasy VII Remake, so people are gonna want the stuff from Final Fantasy VII. What do you do in a situation like this? You make the best with what you're given. That meta-narrative could have worked if executed in a more competent and confident way, but the unfortunate truth is that it wasn't, and it is a black mark on what is otherwise a pretty decent version of this story. Again, I haven't played Rebirth, so I could very well eat my own words, but that's just how Remake makes me feel. On the whole, I can still say that I like this game. It's not as good as I remember it being, but there's still more positives to the experience than negatives. It's just that nowadays, it's easier to notice where those cracks are. At its best, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a cool rendition of a classic tune, completely different in a lot of ways, but with enough familiar here to remind you of the days gone by. FF7 Remake is at its strongest when it's just trying to be that old game done in a modern lens. Where the foundation starts to get rocky and where confidence begins to waver is ironically in the original ideas present. Sometimes the game is a little self-indulgent of the past, throwing in old characters fans might recognize to score some brownie points instead of legitimately adding to the overall experience. I sometimes ask myself who this game was made for specifically, and I struggle to come to a solid conclusion. It wasn't made for the old fans because there's an insistence on making the experience radically different from before, and it isn't made for the new ones because they won't understand what the hell is going on without doing homework. I'm able to follow this stuff because I played the original game and its spin-offs, but someone buying Final Fantasy VII Remake on its own without prior experience will struggle sometimes. Do you have any idea how many people had no idea who Zack even is? While people like me were completely caught off guard with his appearance and survival, a large portion of players didn't know who he was, what's different, and why they should care. Having to stop playing just to skim wiki articles about shitty games does more harm than good. At least it outs all the posers that think Deep Ground is a new addition to the remakes, so that's fun. Even if I hated this story for whatever reason, I can at the very least compliment the positives brought by this new combat system. If I wasn't interested in playing Rebirth to see how it capitalizes on the story promises here, then I can at the very least look forward to seeing how the game design and combat is evolved. It's almost funny that in my very own remake of my own video, I ended up in a similar position to where I was before, excited for the potential, but fearful of the results. Much like the main character, Final Fantasy VII Remake is confused. It's lost and doesn't fully know who it wants to appeal to and what it really wants to be. It knows it has great expectations, but there's an underlying fear that it will never be more than what others said about it. Despite the pressure, Final Fantasy VII Remake dares to rise to that challenge, though its legacy will only be determined by how well it sticks the landing. My biggest fear with this trilogy is that it'll be nothing more than just a longer told version of the original game. I bet all the moments fans will love will be referenced, even if not directly. There's just too much money to be made to simply ignore that. If the story's main appeal is barely being held together as is, then I can only imagine how much of a mess it'll become later on. I can easily imagine a world where this project crashes and burns, becoming nothing more than just a footnote in the history of Square and the Final Fantasy brand on the whole. But that's the funny thing about Destiny. It's never set in stone. At least, that's what you guys told me.
It's on you.
I'll show you what I can.
The sword's gone